Okay. Right, I think we'll just get started, Christine.
Yeah, that's everybody in, Claire.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Lanarkshire Family History Society's webinar for September. My name is Claire Wilson and I'll be your host for this evening. My co-host, amazing co-host as always, is Christine Woodcock from Canada. How are you tonight, Christine?
I'm good, very good. It's afternoon here for us though.
I know. How's the weather in Canada?
Today, not very good. It's like Glasgow weather. It's just raining.
Yeah, I know we went yesterday from having the hottest September day in 100 years to having rain this morning.
We were under a tornado watch 2 days ago, so I'd rather have the rain than be fearing for my life.
yeah, that's it. So I'd be obliged if everyone would mute themselves unless speaking, as this ensures that everyone can hear tonight's presentation with the least amount of background noise. Zoom is becoming really popular these days, so if you would please turn your cameras and your mics off. It just means that it helps to improve the bandwidth and we don't get any freezing of screens or delays as well. And we are streaming this talk, so if you don't want to be seen, then please keep your camera off. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Stephen Mullen. Stephen is a researcher and lecturer in history at the University of Glasgow. Good evening, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi there. Thank you.
How are you tonight?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Yeah, thank you very much for the invite, Claire and Christine. And I'm sure I spoke at Lanarkshire Family History Society maybe about 10 years ago. So I'm sure Bob Stewart was involved and I see him in the audience tonight. So, would you like me to start? Are you continuing? Or?
No, I'll give a bit about your talk. What was your talk about the last time then? Do you remember?
I think it was much more broader. It was just about Glasgow slavery, Scotland. It was just much more general when I had first started doing the research. But I mean, this tonight is about 10 years of research and archives. So it's a book that's coming. It's about Glasgow merchants, the West India merchants. So
a bit more in depth. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Stephen's talk, The Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy, Scotland and Caribbean Slavery, 1775 to 1838, traces the rise of the Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy, as they call themselves. This group were the commercial successors to the famous tobacco lords, whose era ended with the American Revolution in 1775. But the West Indian merchants brought slavery's capital to Scotland in a way that no other commercial group did. This presentation, based on over a decade's research in England, Scotland, America and the Caribbean, examines their operations in the city and examines the impact of slavery-derived wealth on Scotland and its contemporary implications. If you have any questions for Stephen, put them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We do have the option for subtitles on the transcript at the bottom as well, if anybody requires that. And if you would rather...
can I just 2 seconds? You actually need to activate that, Claire.
I've got it coming up.
Have you? Because I don't.
All right, enable.
Yeah, and then if people find that distracting, they can actually click on where it says live transcript and there's an option to hide the subtitle. And I'm looking forward to having these on here just because I want to see how it picks up the Scottish accent. I think it's going to be like that elevator thing, the voice activated elevator where they're trying to get to 11.
11.
11.
Translating wishy accent for other Lanarkshire people, I think.
It's got to come up washy oxen there. Okay, so as I said, if you have a question for Stephen, just pop it into the chat box. If your question is a bit more complex, then please just put a note in the chat box that you wish to ask a question and we will come back to it at the end. So Stephen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I shall share my screen. And that's looking good, is it?
It is,
yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So we'll bow out with our cameras so that you're not staring at us, and we'll be back on if there's any issues or meet you at the end. You can decide whether you want your camera on or off.
Yeah, I'm wondering how I do that.
I'll do it then. Ready?
Yeah, I've turned my camera off. That would be good.
There you go.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, this is, as I've mentioned, this is based on a book that's coming next year, and it's really about this Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy. And as Claire has mentioned, you know, they're the commercial successors to the tobacco lords, which are obviously much more famous in the history of Glasgow. So I realised when I was starting out as a postgraduate back in 2009 then, that they were really under-researched, as well as Scots across the West Indies. And I'm really interested in the economics, you know, and I've spent a bit of research time in Jamaica, Grenada and Trinidad, you know, so I've just been tracing Scots, how many went, how much money did they earn, where did it go? I mean, that is effectively it. But there's various opinions, contemporary opinions. The pro-slavery position on Glasgow in 1833 is put forward by a Peter Bothwick. And he's a member of the West India interest. And he's coming to Glasgow in 1833, and indeed Scotland, he speaks in Edinburgh as well. And he's arguing against slavery should be abolished. He's saying it should continue. He's hoping to convince about the recklessness of the immediate abolition. And he's citing economics. And I think it's worthwhile for me just to read this part of it. And I will take on the part of Bothwick here. I'm here to speak of our brothers and sisters born at, educated at, reared to manhood at home, and now in the possession of these colonies as owners or in some sort moral and civic protectors of those beings in bondage. From them, you, the people of Great Britain, draw a revenue of direct income. You have an encouragement to your industry, which is not equalled by any other market. Tropical produce is exported to you in the form of raw material. It is repurchased by the colonist beyond the price you must pay for it in any other market in the world. Then what is your Bristol, your Liverpool, your Manchester, your Glasgow, your Paisley, your Dundee, your eastern end of the great metropolis, even London itself, if you take from them the West India colonies? Nothing, worse than nothing, one universal scene of beggary and starvation. So this is, of course, I mean, these guys are pro-slavery position. They want to keep going their plantations in the colonies with enslaved people. They also want to continue with their mercantile operations in the UK. But what's interesting, they're saying here that the labour in Great Britain, the manufacturers, the cotton workers, they're talking about a bigger, wider significance for British economy and the British society, particularly in the port cities such as Glasgow, which is of course also manufacturing. But what they're claiming is Great Britain is dependent in slavery. The irony is here that Bothwick's public observations are almost identical to the claims made by influential Caribbean historian and a noted colonial critic, Eric Williams. For in Capitalism and Slavery, it's one of the most seminal books of Caribbean historiography. And he argues, Bothwick and Williams, they both argue that the slave trade and commerce with the slave economies are really fueling the British Industrial Revolution. But Williams is attacking the ideological foundation in what British empire rested, whilst Bothwick has got another motivation. He's trying for the continuation of slavery. But both are agreeing here that Great Britain and Scotland are really dependent on the continuation of slavery. So I think what I do in the lecture tonight, and as well as just my work overall, is I take Glasgow as a key study of the impact of Caribbean slavery and the development of the city and its economy and society. The historical position here is, I would say that in the last maybe 10 years, certainly 20 years, there is an increasing academic interest. I mean, I've talked about the work of Tom Devine. He's, of course, been seminal in Scottish historiography empire, but much of his focus was in the tobacco trade and the tobacco lords. But in the last 15 years, 20 years, there's been a dramatic upsurge of interest in Scottish connections with Caribbean slavery, exemplified by the book Recovering Scotland's Slavery Past, when the contributors were asked to, provide what they wanted to talk about. It was overwhelmingly about the Caribbean. So I think there's a couple of key points I can make here. First of all, there's very few direct slave trade voyages that leave Scotland. That is the triangular trade voyages. We think there's only about 27 that leave Scottish ports between 1706 and 1766. I mean, that's about the number that would have left 1 year from, say, Liverpool or Bristol in the 18th century. But I think this limited involvement with the direct triangular trade has meant that somehow Scots have got off the hook with the wider involvement, which we now know as the involvement with colonial plantation ownership. And this has been exemplified by the work of Nick Draper and the historians at the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project. We know that Scots were disproportionately overrepresented as Caribbean enslavers. And the database is online that I'm sure some of you have already had a look at. So this is the point: very few involvement with the slave trade, much more involvement with plantation slavery in the Caribbean. So this brings us into what's called Glasgow's golden age of sugar, perhaps controversially, because it's certainly not a golden age for enslaved people. But I've mentioned the American Revolution, which is definitely a turning point. But what I would say is that there was long-term sugar industry in Glasgow going back to the 17th century. We know there's 4 sugar houses round about the Gallagate and King Street. They're no longer there. But certainly Glasgow had been importing sugar into refineries from the 17th century. And if we think of tobacco, the golden age of tobacco is only 1740 to 1790, whereas sugar had been getting imported into Glasgow for over 2 centuries. So we take it in that period, sugar and indeed cotton is much more important to the economic development of Glasgow and the west of Scotland. But what we see, the American Revolution certainly is a key turning point because that means the colonial planters in North America, they then cut out Glasgow, which Glasgow was effectively the middleman. It was entrepot trade. They were importing tobacco and then they were exporting it to France. Afterwards, with the American Revolution, it cuts out Glasgow's American markets and its tobacco trade is never more than 25% of pre-war levels. But we know then that the British West Indies is still loyal to the British Empire after 1783 at the end of the war. And then these Glasgow merchants just directly go to colonies with existing Scottish presence. Jamaica in particular, I'll come on to that. The Ceded Islands, Grenada, Tobago, and also Trinidad, and others, St. Vincent. But I've chosen tonight to focus on Jamaica, Grenada, and Trinidad. Textiles, the textile industry is crucially important because these are the 2 leading sectors of the Scottish economy. Linen is important, and then cotton afterwards. And what we're seeing then is we're seeing numerous capital transfers for the West Indies as well. These merchants are becoming fabulously wealthy up to 1838. They're investing, and I'll come on to that later. And we're also seeing these Scots who are going out to the Caribbean. They're known as sojourners. They are intent and quick wealth with a rapid return. So this is the context, and the sugar aristocracy here are very important. And when I say sugar aristocracy, that's what they call themselves. They comprised West India merchants, absentee planters who owned Jamaica estates, for example, and merchant proprietors who were both merchants and planters. They also introduced their sons quite a lot, younger male relatives, into their firms. John Campbell Sr., for example, introduced several of his sons. And then they keep it sort of a closed caste because they're then marrying their sons to daughters of other families with wealth, including West India merchants, as well as tobacco lords. So you're seeing that they're keeping this colonial wealth within the family. Women sometimes inherited slavery wealth. There is no question about that. And in rare occasions, they became involved. One famous example is a Cecilia Douglas. She inherited wealth from her husband, an absentee planter who died. And then she really used the wealth to purchase Orbiston Estate, ironically in Bellshill. We just had a conversation about Bellshill. And this wealth percolated out into the west of Scotland through the landed estates and through inheritance. This is high society, and as you can see here, this is one example of a West India merchant. So how they then really consolidated their political and social influence was through the clubs. Many of the colonial merchants would have attended these clubs. There's a particular associational culture in 18th century British society. These men would have collaborated around about these clubs. They were gentlemen clubs. Sometimes they would drink rum, they would play cards. There's many examples of them. One being the perhaps appropriately named Pig Club, which was the club of the West India interest. Their minutes do not survive, but there's a good book by John Strang, Glasgow and its Clubs, when he talks about how this sugar aristocracy would have frequented. The Bordy Green Cloth was another example. Again, the minutes don't survive, but there's a 19th century book on the Bordy Green Cloth, and from that we can see the membership. And it really illustrates how what they were called at the time was the borough aristocracy. They would meet, it was a whist and supper club. They would meet, it was a elite membership of around 18. And what you can see is that you can see it really joins the mercantile elites with political prominence. There's numerous MPs who are members of the board club, as well as some for the banking fraternity. So what you can see, these are elite clubs that are, really consolidating the social networks and the political influence. These guys are definitely at the peak of high society and, really influencing the west of Scotland and Glasgow in particular. They also collaborate in pro-slavery and lobbying groups. And this is the Glasgow West India Association abstract. As you can see here, it's currently, these minutes and abstracts are held in Glasgow City Archives, and I've been through these in quite considerable detail. The West India Association was a pro-slavery lobbying group. They put forward their arguments in the aftermath of the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. It's not a coincidence it was formed then. It was a defensive reaction to what was going on, the attack, and what they saw as the attack on the imperial economy. So they're lobbying, and we can see very many of the mercantile luminaries at Glasgow named in these lists here. And you can see the names if you can look at the PowerPoint closely. John Campbell Sr. and co, Archibald Smith, John Gordon, Robert Denniston. These are like the top figures in Glasgow's mercantile elite. The biggest figure is James Ewan of Strathleven, and he is really the principal influence on the West India Association. So what we can see here with these clubs and with this association, you can see that the sugar aristocracy are able to promote their West India interests at local level, and they'll be able to put forward the pro-slavery arguments at political level, including in the House of Commons. And the biggest argument between 1807 and 1834 is to convince the British Parliament that slavery should continue. So how were these merchants prepared? Well, I think Old College definitely, which is now the University of Glasgow, was certainly a key place for the West India merchants to go to in their youth. And this is ironic because there's very many merchant critiques of Old College at the time that its arts curriculum was unsuitable. But I still think a high proportion of my merchants attended, around a third in my overall group, simply because that the University of Glasgow retained considerable prestige. And also we now know for the recent study that the University of Glasgow, some of these merchants then donated bequests and slavery wealth to the institution, including James Ewan, which I've mentioned earlier. He's the premier, really at the pinnacle of the Glasgow West India interest, but he donates money, £100 to the University of Glasgow, which becomes the Ewing Gold Medal, which ironically was used and still is used today to train historians in perpetuity. I can say that I never won the prize, but certainly it is still awarded every year. The Andersonian we know is the University of Strathclyde. I think it was a small-scale institution, whilst the West India merchants were in their youth, so I don't think many of them would have attended. I think it was unlikely that there was widespread attendance, but what we do see, there's a really splendid standard of commercial education in Glasgow by the 19th century, and we can see numerous mercantile academies. Probably the highest concentration of such institutions in Scotland are in Glasgow, and they're producing really commercially trained young men on an annual basis. There's a really large pool of talent for these West India firms to take advantage of. So the trade and commerce, I mean, the legal institution, the merchant firm is really the basis of their success. There is no question about that. And we know the top 7 merchant firms because they're registered with the Glasgow West India Association, and they had to pay certain high fees. Stirling Gordon and Co., John Campbell Senior and Co., George and Robert Denniston, Leach and Smith, Buchanan Stephen and Co., David and James Connell, Robert Bogle Jr. And these firms, they operated principally out of counting houses near the Trongate, particularly at Pyle Street, the Tontine Building, Candle Rigs. So this is a typical counting house, connected employees in Glasgow with employees in the West Indies and various other institutions in Scotland. And I have been through very many ledgers and correspondence. Certainly they're training these young men to then communicate with sometimes very good handwriting, multiple copies of letters. You know, it was a very organised system of communications. The firms themselves endured across generations of slave-owning families. I've mentioned that the firms introduced sons, so we do see that is definitely a tactic to limit risks. Promotion of younger sons meant that they could retain the wealth within families. It also meant that the businesses could take advantage through succession, existing contacts, customers and suppliers. This is based in trust. The direct family matrix and the wider familial networks really minimise the risk. And as I mentioned, these 7 merchant houses, they had a minimum of 2 co-partners for the same family. 5 of them were dominated by mercantile patriarchs like John Campbell Senior, and they introduced many sons into the firm. So we can see here, I mean, this is definitely Scots law has got a part to play in the success of these Glasgow West India merchants. Also because they're establishing different firms in the Caribbean, which means if the firms fail, then they cannot be prosecuted in Glasgow or in Scottish courts. So these are very shrewd tactics, and they're taking advantage of the law. So the West Indies, I would say that these firms are definitely more than legal entities because they are serving as communication hubs, mercantile academies, as well as prestigious employers. Young men would have been desperate for jobs with Glasgow West India merchants. But also I need to say that they acted as shipping agents, and we know this from the Glasgow Herald newspaper. There's numerous advertisements of these West India merchant firms as shipping agents. And this is important data, simply because there's incomplete port records for Scotland before 1840. The West Indies or individual colonies are not registered on an individual basis. So the West Indies is just registered as one place. A ship would have went to the West Indies. And if people are trying to obviously calculate and quantify voyages to the West Indies or individual islands, then that becomes problematic. So this is where the Glasgow Herald and the advertisements, the shipping advertisements, are becoming very, very useful. So some of the voyages, I mean, I've been able to, I spent quite a long time going through the Glasgow Herald, and just I thought it was worthwhile trying to estimate, shipping voyages across this key period, 1806 to 1834, which of course traverses the slavery period between the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of plantation slavery in 1834. So I think, I mean, definitely the shipping advertisements in the Herald are telling me that the main ports of departure were Port Glasgow and Greenock. And I'm able to identify a key specialisation in both ports. In the 1770s, Port Glasgow was specialised in tobacco imports, whereas Greenock was the sugaropolis. There is no question about that. In terms of principal port of call, we can see that Jamaica overwhelmingly was the most popular destination for these ships, with over a third of voyages in this period. But we're also able to see is that as the 19th century progressed, then the newer colonies are becoming increasingly popular. I would say after the Union of 1707, Scots are then provided legal access with new colonies. The ceded islands in 1763 become very popular destinations: Grenada, Tobago, Dominica and St. Vincent. And we see large Scottish presence in all of these islands. Trinidad, of course, becomes the third most popular destination. So we're seeing here, these Glasgow merchants are running these voyages. The Scots they're providing a gateway to the Caribbean for these young Scots. So I think, this is essentially speculative history, these numbers here, but it's the best we have from the limited sources that are available. I think the inference would be that as shipping increased across the period 1806 to 1834, the obvious inference is that outward passengers did too. We're able to look at data and see that some of these ships, they took 5, 7 or 9 passengers. So I'm estimating this is between 8,000, 12,000 or 15, up to 15, 16,000 Scots went out there. And again, Jamaica would have been the premier island, and I will come back to that. So Jamaica is definitely the premier Scottish island. There's the highest numbers. Edward Long, who was a planter historian, estimated in 1774 that a full 1/3 of the white population were Scots or of Scottish descent. And when you consider that Scots are about 10% to 12 or 14 of the British population at the time, we're seeing that Scots are disproportionately overrepresented in Jamaica. And Jamaica is the premier jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It is the premier sugar island of the 18th century. It's creating the largest fortunes. It has superseded Barbados in the 18th century. Jamaica was a premier 17th century island. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Scots were overrepresented. We know that after the Darien disaster in the 1690s, Scots went up to Jamaica and created small communities. And these Scots operated in clannish networks. We also know that they're notorious sojourners. They are intent in rapid wealth with a quick return to Scotland. This is the dream, the sojourning dream. A fortune, probably 10,000, would have been enough to become independently wealthy. And then they would come back to Scotland to buy the landed estate. This is the dream. I think very few would have achieved it. And the work that I've been trying to do, which is different from Alan Carris and Douglas Hamilton's work, is I try to look at fortunes. I've been through Scottish legal records and try to estimate just how much money they earned, how much money was enough for them to leave, how much of the money was repatriated back to Scotland. And what's also clear that they're spread across Jamaica. First of all, they're a diverse group. They hailed from regions across Scotland, Highlanders, the northeast, but particularly the lowlands, and especially Edinburgh and Glasgow. We also see that they're across Hanover, Westmoreland in Jamaica, St Thomas in the east. There's very distinctive small Scottish enclaves. And we do see that they're using previous skills. Because they're dominant planting occupations in Jamaica, commerce, as well as skilled and professional trades. What I think is that most Scots would have died in Jamaica. And I think a quarter of my group returned home. But I think, I'm speculating, but I think less than 5% of those who would have acquired good wealth. and probably 1% would have achieved major numbers. In practice, only a minority of these Scots became rich. And one way I've been able to do this is go through the inventory records in Jamaica archives in Spanish Town, visited in 2014, as well as go through the Scottish legal records. So I think low to medium-sized fortunes would have been the norm. They would have been repatriated in life and death. Some of the money went through England, and some of it, most of it, through Scotland. What we're seeing also is that they're an upwardly mobile group. There's, this group of proper-deed Scots across Jamaica, and they're certainly influencing civic matters. For example, they established the first Scottish Presbyterian kirk in Jamaica, in Kingston in 1813. We also see that there's other Scots kirks in the Bahamas and Grenada. So they're able to establish their own religion. And some of them become very wealthy planters, owning enslaved people and sending this money back. We also know that Scots are becoming very prominent across these other islands. And Grenada is a classic second phase Caribbean colony. It is ceded in 1763 after the 7 Years' War, and it had previously been a French colony. But what we do see after 1763, it becomes the second most important sugar producer in the British West Indies. By 1772, the estimates are showing that 54 Scots own about 40% of all land. Again, when you think that Scots are only about 10% of the British population, then, I mean, this is disproportionately higher than what we would expect. Excuse me. There is a rebellion on Grenada, 1795, 1796, known as the Fedon Rebellion, where the Free People of Colour joined forces with the enslaved. The Scottish governor at the time, Ninian Hume, was captured and beheaded. But ultimately the rebellion was put down. And afterwards, what we can see is that many Scots are involved with the post-Fedon rebuilding, including a Lanarkshire man, James McQueen, who travelled a Western Hall in Grenada. You can see a picture I've taken here when I was there in April 2014. But certainly there have been numerous Lanarkshire young men, a lot of Glaswegians and a lot of Scots in general in Grenada. I've been able to estimate that I think around half the white population of Grenada were Scottish. And I've been able to do this. I've looked at the records of the St. George's Presbyterian Kirk in Grenada. It's actually still standing, although it's a ruin after Hurricane Ivan in 2004. But it's still there. And I think Scots represent a half of the white population of Grenada. So if you think some of them are repatriating wealth to Scotland, this must have had a bigger influence than we've considered, historians have considered. One way of doing this is looking at inventories, looking at these legal inventories that are held through Scotland's people, which I'm sure is very familiar to all of you as genealogists and family historians. It's a great resource for academic work as well, if expensive. But again, I've been looking at some of the Grenada fortunes, including the fortune of James Buchanan. You can see here, he is commemorated in the Merchant's House in Glasgow with a marble bust, a Roman-like figure here. But he certainly was in Jamaica as a he was in Grenada first as a young man with his firm, Buchanan Stephen and Co. He then goes to Jamaica and then Brazil. These three colonies are slave colonies when he's there. He earns a huge fortune and he leaves it to the city of Glasgow and Edinburgh. Unusually, he prohibits major sums to his family. In his will, he says, to give large sums of money to relations is oftentimes attended with mischievous results. So he's pretty unusual, though, in that he is dedicating it to civic improvement. Scots are also important over third phase colonies, and I've picked here Trinidad, the majority of the work I have done in Trinidad is different from Jamaica and Grenada simply because it is a Spanish colony up to 1797. I mean, this is almost at the end of the slavery period. It was underdeveloped at that point, but it is then subsumed into the British Empire in the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802. And the British had been there in the late 18th century beforehand. But this is an important island simply because it is subsumed during the gradual abolition era. Britain, the British Parliament, had already committed to the gradual abolition of the slave trade in 1792, but this island is taken, and then they try to develop it at the same time as abolition is supposedly progressing. So there is not as a large enslaved population. They're always struggling for an enslaved labour force. And Trinidad's only a slave colony for about 37 years. And I think this is one of the explanations. It's a much more diverse society, French and Spanish. And the Scots definitely are a smaller group, but they are still fairly prominent. And this is what I've been focusing on the research. The research I've conducted is in a man called John Lamont, who was a Highland son. He was an illegitimate son of a laird. He was denied any inheritance at all, we think, because of his illegitimate status. But he then travels to Trinidad, we think, in 1802. So this is really at the very start of, the colonisation of Trinidad. He becomes huge wealth. He accumulates several plantations. He's probably the second largest owner of enslaved people in the abolition of plantation slavery in 1834. The irony is, I mean, there's very little correspondence with Lamont. I've been able to work in the legal records, but he says in some of the family correspondence that I found that he only intended to live in frugal independence. But as it turns out, he acquired a substantial fortune in his 48 years in Trinidad that would have ranked him amongst the richest men in Scotland. And we can see some of his rise because he testifies before a parliamentary committee in the 1820s. He's originally an overseer. He then becomes a manager or an attorney for an estate, including for Glasgow merchants. He then accumulates this huge fortune, which was repatriated to Scotland. And here is the unusual thing about John Lamont. I've mentioned that Scots are notorious sojourners, i.e. they never wanted to settle in the Caribbean. They wanted to earn as much money through the exploitation of enslaved labour, and then they wanted to come back with a landed estate. Lamont doesn't. He's very unusual in that he wants to stay in Trinidad to die in harness, as he put it. And I think there is a reason for this. I think it's partly due to his illegitimate status. He had more rank and social influence in Trinidad, and I think he just felt much more at home. But what he did do, he then gets in touch with his family who had ostracised him, the Lairds of Knockdhu and Argyll. Once he became rich, the Lairds, his half-brothers, contact him in Trinidad and they come out. So he sends much of the fortune home and he buys Benmore House, which you can see here, which I visited in 2013. Benmore House in the Cowell Peninsula in Argyll. It's just close to Dunoon. And that's a picture of me and a Trinidadian academic, actually, Professor Selwyn Cudjoe. He had grown up next to Lamont's estates when he was a child. And that day he told me that allowed him to square the circle. He is descended from enslaved people. And this allowed him to see where the wealth is going. So here is, briefly, here's just some of the fortunes I've been working on. You can see Jamaica, Tobago, Grenada, Trinidad. If £100,000 is nationally significant fortune, then we can see only one there would have met that standard. But at the same time, this is almost £750,000 here. And this is big money coming into Scotland and Glasgow. across this period. So back to the sugar aristocracy, I've done a short, brief survey of the wealthy Scots, how they went out there. And I think I'll really spend some time now talking about the same sort of analysis of the sugar aristocracy, because much of my analysis has been focused on the subscribers of the Glasgow West India Association. They were absolutely the mercantile elite of Glasgow. They've got the strongest connections. They invested in landed estates. The most successful merchants would have put money into landed estates, absolutely. And I think around 40 of my group were in possession of landed estates. The estates themselves were located in the west of Scotland, particularly Glasgow, Ayrshire, Dumbarton and Argyll. We know that from the Sazines records of land transfers. One example, well, a couple of examples, but first of all is Richard Denniston's Kelvingrove Mansion. Unfortunately, it's no longer there, but it was in what is now Kelvingrove Park, where the Kelvingrove Museum is. For those of you that know it, perhaps where the skating park is today, that would have been where the Great Mansion would have been. And there's some very good legal records about Richard Denniston, and we can get a real glimpse into his lifestyle. I looked at some of his alcohol collection in particular. He had like 24 dozen bottles of rum. He had whiskey. He had enough for the biggest party for Glasgow has ever seen. And this is just representative of the high consumption lifestyles that they would have lived. The question is, to what extent did the sugar aristocracy contribute to the agricultural revolution, 1760, 1800? Well, I think certainly the majority of their purchases were coming after 1800. I think tobacco wealth into the Scottish agricultural revolution would have had a greater impact. But what we do see, this is the continuation of it. They're putting the money into innovative agricultural improvement, and they're also disseminating their slavery-derived wealth across the west of Scotland. They accumulate huge movable property, is in addition to the landed estates and the urban property. So I think, I've tracing, almost 3 million, and there's a super wealthy group of 8 who accumulate £100,000 or more. Now, I've already mentioned this 100,000 is the big number. If you had £100,000 on death in the 19th century, then you were, this was a nationally significant fortune. James Ewing of Strathleven leaves the largest fortune of all. When you can see that this is his portrait in the merchant's house. He, as I've mentioned, he's alumni of the University of Glasgow. He is the Lord Provost. He's the first MP for Glasgow after the 1832 Reform Act. He purchases Strathleven Estate in Dumbarton. He is really at the pinnacle of the sugar aristocracy. And as I mentioned, he donates the money for the Ewan Prize Medal to train historians at the University of Glasgow as well. And incidentally, is when the University of Glasgow conducted their study of slavery wealth 2018, his wealth and the wealth of James Buchanan that I've mentioned earlier in Grenada, I'll come back to James Buchanan here. Their 2 bequests to the merchant's house were they were amalgamated in the 19th century, and it was sent to the University of Glasgow, or at least the interests of it, the interest from it, and it was used to pay staff costs at the University of Glasgow. They also invest, more broadly, the sugar aristocracy have got investments in commerce and industry, particularly in cotton. We know that many of them are investing in vertical integration. They're putting money into cotton manufacturers. They're also investing in banks and insurance. I think it's highly improbable merchant capital, that is, these direct investments are a principal determinant of the Scottish Industrial Revolution. It's certainly a contributing force, there is no question, but as R.H. Campbell notes, the merchants' greatest contribution was not becoming industrialists, but it was continuing as merchants. These merchants ensured the flow of the slave-grown produce, the cotton, and to a lesser extent, the sugar. And it allows the manufacturers of Scotland to export to the big markets that they needed across the Caribbean. And this is how the big multiplier effects of cotton and linen, to a lesser extent, are getting sent to the Caribbean. It is the markets, it's the mercantile trades that are having the biggest influence. And we think it's employing, huge swathes of the Scottish population. There is then a question then, is the Scottish population, they're certainly not culpable in slavery, some of them are, but do they become complicit with working in these industries that are dependent in slavery, such as cotton? Just in conclusion then, so I think the race equality framework, Goal 13, Scottish Government's race equality framework, is to promote inclusiveness and participation by making better connections between minority ethnic communities, organisations and institutions involved in heritage, culture, sports and media. And one of the key goals is to acknowledge the social and economic impact of New World slavery and the development of modern Scotland. So I guess the work here definitely contributes to that. There is a greater awareness, not just me, but other historians are now emphasising in much greater detail how slavery contributed to the economic and societal development in Scotland. I should say the limitations analysis, we're looking at a few hundred men. I mean, this is inventories of wealth, and then we're trying to look for bigger patterns. But it's significant. These are some of the richest men in Scotland, absolutely. But at the same time, this is about individual wealth. We can also look at some of their investments in death. And again, that's problematic, because how do you ascertain investments in life before they died? Some of them might have got rid of their wealth. But at least the probate inventories or the confirmation inventories that we tend to work on they're shown us enough about patterns of individual investments and patterns of investments. I would say that certainly slave ownership and profiteering for Atlantic commerce was not an exclusively elite enterprise. Many Scots that I have examined came from humble backgrounds and they travelled to the Caribbean. There is evidence to suggest that they were disproportionately overrepresented Jamaica, Grenada, and to a lesser extent Trinidad. In the period that Robert Burns didn't go to Jamaica, I think many hundreds, many thousands would have. I would say that probably only a minority of Scots who went to the West Indies would have survived. I think they would have died from yellow fever is probably a much more likely outcome. And I think even an even smaller group would have been able to repatriate money. But certainly what we do see is that these sojourners are donating money to family. There is lots of evidence about sending money home to mothers, to sisters, and certainly that this is across Scotland. So the absolutely crucial point here is we're seeing that slavery is permeating through inheritance and through philanthropy. It is permeating into many aspects of the Scottish economy in general, and Glasgow's in particular. Family were, I would think, generally the main beneficiary. But at the same time, the impact of philanthropy and charitable enterprise had a large and wide-ranging impact. James Buchanan's bequests, for example, and many others. So this work is adding to the growing corpus of evidence that reveals how the labour of African and African enslaved people, as well as the labour of Scots and immigrant groups, contributed to the development of modern Scotland. So thank you.
That was great, Stephen. Just a quick, if anyone has any questions, you can still pop them into the chat box now. let you get your breath back. That was really interesting. I was actually quite surprised at the kind of percentages of Scots that were going to some of these places. I've got certainly some of my family that worked in customs in Jamaica, and I've got a couple of shipmasters from Banff as well. That it's the kind of period, the late 1700s, so it's quite hard to find where they were going, but I suspect it might have been out in that direction. So yeah, you've given me a wee bit of a kind of passion, I think, to try and maybe look a bit more into it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, what the job that you guys do, you know, you need to identify individuals and trajectories, and you know, it's quite difficult to do that because the sparsity of records in Scotland and the Caribbean. But what I'm doing is something different. I'm just looking for a big sample. If it makes sense, I'm not interested in a specific person.
Yeah.
If it makes sense. I'm only interested in generality. If I can find all the appropriate a confirmation inventory, I will. Then that really suits me. So I'm not particularly interested in who they are. That does become important, but I don't need to trace that individual person. You know, it'd be really onerous then to get a person and try to look who their fathers were, or you know. So you have my sympathy. It's a difficult job.
Yeah. Right, let's just have a quick look at, I don't know where Christine's gone. She fell asleep. So we've got quite a lot of people from all over the place today. We've got Toronto, Canada, Surrey, York, Falkirk, Motherwell, Ayrshire, Dundee. Yeah, lots from Canada, Straven, Hampshire. Yep, they're coming from all over the place today. Now I did see a question.
Yeah, I think there's two there. There's one for Jane.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, I'm interpreting ordinary Scots to mean Scots of lower rank. I mean, but absolutely, the answer is, I mean, this is one of the myths that we're going to be demolishing, is that slavery in West India commerce was an elite enterprise. That's simply not the case. We know that from the Glasgow Caribbean labour market. They are recruiting young men with specific skills, agricultural, tradesman skills. There is no way that everybody who goes to the Caribbean from Scotland is gentry. Some of them would have been middling. Probably the most were middling. But certainly there's lower ranked Scots, absolutely. And they would have signed indenture contracts, which would have tied them for 47 years. They would have got probably paid about £30 a year, and it would have tied them into a contract. The likelihood they wouldn't have lasted to the end of the contract, but certainly very many Scots we would know today as tradesmen skills would have went there and earned fortunes. So there's letters in the Jamaica National Library about joiners, Scottish joiners, who are sending money. They're sending correspondence back home and saying to their pals in Edinburgh, the pay's great here, you need to come out. These are absolutely no gentry. So, I mean, that's just in summary, I would say, absolutely, this is not an elite enterprise. Many lower ranked Scots involved.
That's it. And I mean, I think no matter where people are travelling to in the world, you know, the word got back to Scotland that, you know, there's plenty of jobs out here, there's great prospects, you know, great living, you know, they'll go where it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, especially if things aren't too good in Scotland at the time. I did see. And then there's one that says, are there any records or statistics of ordinary Scots going to the West Indies?
Yeah, I think that was the one
Is that the one you've...
Next one, Heather McTavish Tay. Is there any way to find out about specific Scots to various islands? Well, I think, I mean, just as we've had that conversation there, Heather, it's quite difficult to trace specific Scots. It's not impossible, but I mean, I'm sure you're familiar. Just try search engines, National Library of Scotland, National Records of Scotland. There is also a series of source books by David Dobson, Scots in the West Indies, and these are great. They provide he's accumulated just records of individual Scots, just a sample, just a specific source, whether it be an obituary, whether it be a legal record, a will. He's been very good, so I would say they're the best source books. What else off the top of my head? I mean, sometimes you can look at the University of Glasgow matriculation lists, and sometimes they tell you about Scots who have died in the Caribbean, particularly because of the work of the registrar, Addison, great records. But again, this is a hit and a miss. There is no shipping that is really, really patchy. There is no comprehensive list of, certainly before 1840, of lists of people. There is just no way to do it, and the evidence is completely lacking, unfortunately.
Unfortunate, isn't it? Margaret's asking, the area in Glasgow where her father was born was Mare Street and Plantation. Is it possible that the area of very poor Glaswegians got their district name from the plantations of tobacco, sugar, or another?
Well, certainly it's owned by a West India merchant or a tobacco merchant who becomes West India involved, and his name's John Robertson. So there is a bit of a debate whether it was already named when he took it on. So I don't want to give a definitive answer on that at the moment, but I mean, I would certainly say it's possible, and it would seem to me quite likely. But considering, I mean, I'm doing an audit for Glasgow City Council at the moment on street names, so I don't want to give an answer at the moment. So we'll have a discussion about this later.
Is that something they're going to publish, do you think?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that'll be next year.
That's all right. We can look forward to that then, because I think that'll be quite interesting. So Murray's asking, do records of any of these firms survive?
Yes, they do, Murray. There's very good records of Alexander Houston and Co. And they are the premier Scottish West India firm in the 1790s. They're huge. And they're contributing to the intercolonial slave trade. So they own these plantations in Grenada and Tobago. And it just means that the plantations need to be stocked to enslave people. So even though Scots are not involved with the direct trade, the triangular trade, it's shown that these firms, the records in the National Library of Scotland are shown that how these firms are really contributing to that. They went bankrupt in the 1790s after the Dawn Rebellion, and I think that's why their records are preserved. But there's not actually that many. There's one or two others, but we're really lacking beyond that one big example, Alexander Houston and Co. There's other ways to do it. You know, I've wrote 2 articles on actually specific West India firms. The records of John Campbell Senior and Co. are in Glasgow City Archives. And I wrote another article on Leach and Smith, which was the firm of Archibald Smith of Jordan Hill. The Campbell Senior records are better than Leach and Smith's, but I was able to go to Grenada and look at the other side of Leach and Smith's operations. They provided a lot of mortgages secured in estates and enslaved people. So there's different ways to do it. But what I would say in summary, we don't have a big cache of, say, 20 records. Unfortunately, they're just not there. We've got a few big examples.
Sorry, Christine's just cloned herself, I think, there. What happened to you?
Sorry. I don't know. As soon as Stephen stopped sharing his screen, everything just went. I mean, I could still see you and hear you, but I couldn't do anything else.
Okay.
Sorry. Must have been me.
We're just running through the questions. Great question from Karen.
Yeah.
What kind? Can you see that one?
Yeah, it's a cracker.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. Very good question. I would say, I mean, Tom Devine says that firstly, Tom Devine argues that the Glasgow colonial merchants, the contribution of the colonial wealth, that is both tobacco and West India money, Virginia and West India merchants. He argues that colonial wealth made a contribution of the first order to the Scottish agricultural revolution between 1760 and 1800. He also claimed in the recent Recover in Scotland Slavery Past that sojourning wealth, i.e. the returnees from the Caribbean, again was a prime source for agricultural transformation. I think I'm not so sure the second part of it is true. I think much more sojourners would have died, but that remains to be, I'll quantify that as I go along. But what you do see, I mean, this is the dream, is the Caribbean money and come back to a landed estate. And we can contrast that with tobacco money, because Scottish immigration to North America was about settling. You know, they wanted to go to permanent immigration. There are very few sojourners compared to the Caribbean, which were quintessential sojourning, exploitative trips and back. So in theory, Caribbean money would have had a bigger impact. I think Scotland would have looked very different. Absolutely. I think overall, Atlantic slavery in general and Caribbean exploitation in particular was a prime source. The Scottish Industrial Revolution, 1760, 1830. We know that the two leading sectors of the economy, linen and then cotton, were completely underpinned by Caribbean connections. The money through philanthropy, not just industry, but philanthropy and commerce. It's impossible to say how Scotland would look, but, certainly we can look at the example of one institution. The University of Glasgow done a mea culpa in 2018. They acknowledged that they had, taken up to 200 million in today's monies. And that had been used for, staff costs, for students, scholarships. Sometimes it was used for infrastructure like buildings. I mean, how do you quantify the importance of that? It's very difficult to say, well, if that hadn't have been there, then, this would be different, or this building would be different. Or how do you quantify the money that goes into education for white society from the 1760s onwards? These students are becoming educated through Caribbean bequests. They are then contributing in different ways. So I think Scotland would have looked very different. And some institutions would have been very smaller. It's just impossible to really quantify that in any meaningful way. But thank you for the question.
That was a great question. Jane's asking, is the Robert Denniston family related to the Denniston family of today's Denniston in Glasgow? I did think that myself when I heard Denniston. I thought, oh.
I never knew there was a Denniston family in today in Glasgow. I mean,
well, the area of Denniston, I'm thinking.
Oh, it's connected to, definitely. I mean, the Dennistons are the big major players, in tobacco. And then latterly they're involved with the Caribbean as well. There is no question. Some of them, I'm sure it was James Denniston of Golf Hill. He's laying out some of Denniston. Oh, absolutely, that's tobacco. That's for and you'll see that. I mean, that's not an unusual story because a lot of parts of Greater Glasgow today started as colonial merchants' estates. Denniston being the key example, but Jordan Hill was West India merchants. The University of Glasgow campus was Gilmore Hill. So parts of Greater Postle was a colonial merchants' estate. I'm sure it was much more salubrious back then. But certainly these parts of Greater Glasgow were originally feued off in estates, particularly the Barney.
I think that's always interesting. I mean, I've been doing kind of research into the New Monkland area.
Yeah.
And the more you get into things and start looking at families, the more you realise that's why that place is called that. It's after a really prominent family, or that's why that street's named that.
Well, they're definitely involved there. The Buchanans own, what's the big estate out there? Drumpelia.
I was going to say that, yeah.
It's Drumpelia. I mean, I've looked at their records in council archives. But also what you need to say is these merchants become involved with transport. So they're putting money into tobacco laws, in particular, the Forth and Clyde Canal.
That's right, yeah.
The Monklands Canal. And that is because they want to start exploiting the mineral resources, coal, and they ship it east and west. They want to send the coal out. So, I mean, it's having these bigger influences. It's these big linkages, they're putting merchant capital in, and it's just contributing to the economic development.
Amazing. Christine, have you got any questions?
No, but, I just think that you see a lot of those same names out here, so their wealth has extended obviously just beyond sort of the UK and the Caribbean, because, they're in here in Canada as well.
Yeah, well, I see that.
And really made a name for them.
Yeah, I see Canada is just going through a reassessment of these historic Scots who seem to have got away with it for so long. So we know John A. MacDonald was a genocidal alcoholic Glaswegian.
MacDonald was my maiden name, and I refuse to use my maiden name anymore. I just thought about something else. Listen, when you were saying that you were doing the, in Henry Dundas, I mean, there's villages, there's streets. Every city has a street that's Dundas.
Well, I testified before Toronto City Council quite recently because I'm just about to publish an article on Henry Dundas next month. So they asked me to testify just about his culpability in delaying the transatlantic slave trade. So
And that's a major street that runs from Toronto, right? So when you were saying that you were doing the inventory for council on the streets, is that for the same reason, like to change the names maybe?
I won't have any role in that. There'll certainly be a consultation about what's to happen. You know, it's broader than just street names. It's statues, it's buildings as well, it's buildings. So, I mean, there will be a consultation. I'm a Lanarkshire man, as you know. I live in Lanarkshire, so I won't be involved in the consultation. I'm simply there to provide the evidence.
No, but is that why they've asked you to do that?
Well, there is a consultation. I have no idea what the remit is going to be at the end of it. I have no idea about the capacity of what they'll do.
Just be a wait and see, I think.
And there will be a consultation.
Yeah.
They went public with that. They'll consult.
Yeah.
And this preempted Black Lives Matter last summer, but it was obviously, there's a great impetus. I mean, there's a growing anti-racist environment across British society, and there's a reckoning how Britain memorialises historic individuals. I mean, it's not just Britain, it's America and it's Canada, it's any post-colonial state. I mean, should these men, and it's overwhelmingly men, I mean, should they be celebrated in civic space if they had either took wealth of the colonies, they were involved in exploitation, genocide? It's a bigger question than slavery. It's also about colonialism. We don't really hear about that at the moment, but that'll be the big question in the next 25 years, I would think.
That's all we hear over here, particularly with McDonald and him moving Indigenous people out onto reserves and starting the residential schools. And, you've probably heard about all the children's bodies that are being uncovered at school. It's huge here right now, huge.
Yeah, well, I mean, the statues become sort of lightning rods, and it becomes, it's traumatic for people to see that these men who have been involved in genocide, colonialism, slavery, and there's definitely questions how people are celebrated and memorialised.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would say, I mean, there's nuance in that, because the most prominent African Caribbean spokesperson in Scotland today is Professor Sir Jeff Palmer. He's a Jamaican, Scots, but Jeff actually says, do not remove. Jeff, do not remove the statue, do not remove street names. If you remove the evidence, you remove the crime. So, I mean, there is a nuanced position on it. It's not just as simple as, well, this person did this and therefore we remove. It does require careful conversations.
Well, and that's the same here, because with the residential schools, it's save the evidence. Because if you tear that down, that piece of the history is gone, right? It's easy to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, but I mean, this is where historians and genealogists and anybody interested in empirical fact finding, we've all got an important role here to clarify. And I think over the last year in particular, there's been a rush to make assessments. And this is why there should be careful studies about individual roles, and then other people can decide culpability, complicity, should they be removed. So this is, there's a great need for us type of empirical fact finders.
Yes, I think a lot can be learnt from history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes tearing that down, it's then forgotten, where that can be used as an example moving forward.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to lose it, right? Or repeat it. So, Stephen, I just wanted to, for anybody who's watching, and there are quite a few, I saw a 2-part series that was, I think, on BBC that you were a part of, and so was Jeff Palmer on Glasgow, and it was brilliant. So, for anybody who, I think it's on YouTube actually. Yeah. But a brilliant series. And then talking, even with the Jamaicans, talking about, what their thoughts are on monetary reparation.
About reparation, it was a David Heyman production. It was a really privilege to be involved, and there was a great. They got the mix right, between historians, scholars. They travelled to Jamaica, as you saw. They also went to Bristol and Liverpool. So they seen how I was approaching it. So I thought it was a brilliant programme. The name of it is called Scotland's Hidden Shame. Scotland's Hidden Shame.
And even just when they went, though, to Sierra Leone.
Yeah, they went to Sierra Leone as well, that's right.
I think that, the Scotsman was the one who was sending them off to slavery.
That's right. Richard Oswald, the Autumn actually his estate today is Ayrshire Agricultural College, where the Ayrshire Archives. So it's again, these legacies are still there. Yes, yeah. Scotland's hidden shame, something like that, Linda.
Yeah, it was Scott. Yes, hidden shame or secret shame or something. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, 2 parts.
David Heyman slavery program, and you'll get it.
Okay. So what have you got moving forward? You mentioned that you were writing articles. I know that you've got a book in the pipeline.
Yeah, I mean the Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy book, where you've got a wee flavour of it tonight. You know, that's coming. Probably, definitely next year. Got an article on Henry Dundas coming in October in the Scottish Historical Review, and then I'm working on the audit for Glasgow City Council, and that's just a discrete consultation piece of work, though, as an academic piece.
So lots to look forward to read. Yes, it's been a long project.
Book comes out, so we can promote that.
I'll be glad to get rid of it. I'll be honest, it's for a long time.
We'll be happy to read it, but we need to know when it's out.
I know. Yeah,
it'll be next year at some point.
Yeah, keep us updated. And
there is the good thing with this new series is with the Royal Historical Society, it will be published as an open access at the same time as a print copy, which I think is a great resource. I mean, I'm sure all of you wanted to buy an academic text, including me, and the prices are just far too prohibitive. But there's now a move towards open access publication. So it'll be print on demand for proper books, but it'll also be open access. So you won't have to pay, I don't know, 50 quid is what they usually are or something like that. So that's a great development.
That's good. So we'll keep in touch with you, Stephen, and obviously when it comes out, certainly Christine and myself can get it onto all our relevant pages and certainly on the Family History Society as well. Linda's saying, everybody's saying, well, very interesting this evening, great to hear about open access. Linda says travels to Scotland pretty often, feels like a home. That's nice to hear. Right, so just a quick reminder, next month's webinar takes place on the 14th of October at 7 p.m. The speaker is Robert Howie of Historic Edinburgh Tours, and Robert's talk covers Prince Charlie's Edinburgh, the Jacobite occupation of 1745. We both know Robert quite well, don't we, Christine? And he's a
fact.
Yep, he knows his stuff. He does a lot of, he's a teacher, but he also does a lot of talk tours in Edinburgh, around about Greyfriars and various other places. So yeah, he's passionate about the city. If you're not already a member of Lanarkshire Family History Society, why not sign up now? Membership fees range between £10 and £16 per year, and you can find out more via the Lanarkshire Family History Society website. I've also detailed the website address where you can check that out in the chat box, along with the links for Robert's talk next month. I'd like to thank you very much, Stephen, on behalf of Lanarkshire Family History Society. We look forward to hearing when your book comes out and anything else that you're doing. It's been really
Thank you very much for the invite. It's great to come back and speak to the Lanarkshire Family History Society. It's been superb, so thank you.
No problem.
We'll see you in another decade.
Yeah, I'll see you in another decade of the next book. Aye, thanks, Christine. Good to see you.
Who knows what will be next? Or have you got something in the pipeline at the moment? Whenever you finish this one?
No, well, that's it. I don't know. I mean, I've PhD a number of years ago now. Maybe I'll just go back to the bookies and work. I don't know. Maybe.
Nah, I don't think you'll go back after that. You'll find something else that's quite
interesting. Let's wait and see.
Well, thank you very much anyway, and thank you everyone for attending tonight, and we will see you next month. Take care.